From national security to global corruption, you're with Scott Wheeler and Through the Looking Glass on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Through the Looking Glass. I'm Scott Wheeler, broadcasting from Washington, D.C. on TNT Radio. Right now, going into this half hour, we were discussing the reason people distrust institutions in the United States and how it's weakening our unity as a nation. And we were talking about the denial that many in the media and in science were claiming in the 1970s of a cooling period. And we just went through a long list of headlines from news organizations from the 1970s laying out that there was this widespread belief that we were heading for an ice age. And even though now trying to find that evidence is much more difficult. Right now, let me bring in our expert witness. Gordon Fulks has a Ph.D. in physics from the Laboratory of Astrophysics and Space Research at the University of Chicago. He recently wrote a piece for Real Clear Energy about the pseudoscience that has replaced real science in so many universities and throughout the government, it seems. Dr. Fulks, welcome to Through the Looking Glass. Thank you for taking the time for joining us to join us.
Yes, thank you. Good morning from my perspective.
Yes, you're on the West Coast. Recently, you called attention to a NOAA temperature graph from a few years ago. You had taken one, and it was showing different temperatures plotted than the same graph now that's supposed to cover that period. What do you think happened here?
Well, they obviously changed something, and you look at it, they changed it to suit their perspective, which is that we're heating inevitably to a catastrophe sort of thing, even though scientists don't back that point at all. What they have done is taken the liberty to correct previous temperature readings going back to the beginning of the 20th century and make them look like we've warmed considerably over that period of time. And they use as an excuse the time of day that the measurements were taken. There's a little bit of bias in there from that, and that can be corrected, but they correct it in their own way. And there have been other instances during the Obama administration. We saw that occur when in the run-up to the Paris Climate Conference, Obama wanted something that was more definitive, so his people got to work. I think John Holdren was involved and changed the climate record to suit their perspective. There was one man who worked for that group who retired and blasted what they had done because he was right there observing it personally. What I found was that years ago I put together a presentation about the weather in the Pacific Northwest. I took the NOAA Climate at a Glance temperature record and presented that, and it showed essentially no net temperature gain over the 20th century and into the 21st century. Then a few years later, I went to simply update that and noticed that they'd changed everything. They'd cooled the past to make the present look warmer, and there wasn't the justification. They didn't even provide any justification for that. So they're playing games, and many of the federal agencies are doing that, and of course, many of the professors at universities are in on the same scam.
You in your piece for you say scientists are worried as well they should be. The latest recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics, John Clauser, one of your colleagues at the CO2 Coalition, warns that climate science has become pseudoscience. Meanwhile, Jim Skay, the chairman of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with the IPCC, where so much of the climate data comes from these days, and the warnings and advice on governments to deal with it. He criticizes climate hyperbole as his boss, UN Secretary General Guterres, promotes global boiling. Additionally, high-profile billionaires Bezos, Zucker, Zuckerberg, Soros, and Gates throw their wealth into climate alarm. Mainstream media outlets are recruiting highly politicized young journalists to promote hysteria. The fate of science is at stake, and consequently, the fate of the civilization it supports. It's a very powerful statement, but it's hard to ignore that everywhere we look. I've been in journalism 27 years. Everywhere you look, we are inundated with hyper and more extreme than ever warnings and dire threats of dire consequences if we don't immediately ban all fossil fuels. Is there a reason that people should be alarmed, or is this, would you describe it as something else, being motivated by a political agenda or something like that?
Well, they take something with a tiny bit of truth to it and blow it way out of proportion. And that's been the formula for a long period of time now, especially where they can make a lot of money, where they can enjoy a comfortable existence as a professor at some university or enjoy a job with the federal government. It's easy to blame carbon dioxide for everything, and they pretty much do. But there is no reason for any alarm about the climate any more than you'd have an alarm about the weather. It may be not to your liking tomorrow, but there's nothing you can really do about it. And this business that it's all due to human emissions of carbon dioxide is just ludicrous. That effect is very tiny. And as John Clauser, the Nobel laureate in physics last year, points out, that there are other effects in the climate that are far greater, such as the effect of the clouds. I would point out that the effect of the oceans is far larger than that. So what the alarmists do to tie this into any sort of science is to say that, okay, carbon dioxide is a very minor effect, but we get a lot of help from water vapor, which then acts as an amplifier of the climate signal. And then Clauser will come in and say, hey, wait a minute, if you do that, then you're going to get more clouds and you're going to get more cooling, and we're back to a stable climate, or to a climate that varies a lot but is inherently stable. And that's the scientific argument. They just carry it to a certain point and then say, look at what's going to happen if you don't cut back your use of the automobile. And then I would say, okay, have these electric vehicles done anything to improve the climate? Have the windmills done anything to improve the climate? Have the solar cells done anything to improve the climate? No, they haven't. We're still on the same trajectory. We've been warming a little bit, presumably from an El Nino sort of situation, possibly from a little bit of carbon dioxide. But that is so minor, it is something that we should be ignoring and trying to figure out more of the long-term climate implications. And some of those are due to orbital cycles of the Earth, the Milankovitch cycles. And these are things that scientists actually agree on. I went to a presentation by James Hansen, who is one of the primary alarmists, and he presented this at Oregon State University. He presented the same graph that I presented and showed that he agreed with the Milankovitch orbital cycle interpretation of that. So that's the sort of science that we really want to get back to, this hyperbole, this exaggeration, this basic nonsense that we hear from journalists, I'm sorry to say that, but from journalists all the time, is something that has to be taken out. I remember one journalist was some years ago was interviewing Ralph Cicerone, who was at the time the president of the National Academy of Sciences, and he pressed him very hard on this idea of catastrophe. Are we facing a catastrophe? And Cicerone finally said, we don't have the evidence for that. In other words, what we're dealing with here are slight variations in the climate that are going to be there anyway, whether or not we burn fossil fuels. So it's all something that has become what I would call a scam. I think that's a good way of putting it.
In fact, others have said similar things when they actually press the alarmist scientists. They will always kind of back away from any absolutes in it at all. But I've noticed when I question warming alarmist scientists, they refer to peer-reviewed papers. Have you found that peer-reviewed papers are not what people think they are?
Well, peer-reviewed papers, it was a system that should work very well, where you come up with an idea, you do the research, you write it up, you present it to your peers, and they look at it and say, is this worthy of publication? Not is it right, it's just, is it worthy of publication, such that other scientists should look at it and work from that. The problem is, as we found with the ClimateGate emails more than a decade ago, the climate crowd had found a way to game the system. They put pressure on editors to publish only their papers or publish their papers in preference to others. And now today, it's only alarmist papers that are published in the climate arena. So it's a system that is broken. It's no longer peer review, it's PAL review, and that indicates that the papers have no value. You might think that this is only a problem in climate science. It's just most obvious in climate science because many of us don't pay attention to the other arenas, but the medical arena, the epidemiological arena, where careerism is a problem, where the political components that are a problem. The situation is also wildly out of control. The editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal, very well-known British medical journal, The Lancet, Richard Horton, has been saying for years that half of the papers he publishes in the medical arena cannot be replicated. And what that means is if you give it to another set of researchers who are independent from the first set of researchers, and they do the same experiments, they won't come up with the same results, which means the original results were likely wrong. And it's even worse in epidemiology because you're dealing with probabilities there, you're dealing with statistics. It's the results are not as clear, and 90% of the papers are not worth anything. I can give specific examples of where that occurs. It's completely out of the climate arena, but it's the same problem. It's people wanting to make a name for themselves, wanting to have a steady job, wanting tenure at a university, and they put out a lot of trash, and it does get published, and that means the journals themselves are at best not reliable. It's really worse than that in some ways. There have been a few instances where they'll stand up to outright fraud, and one good example of that is University of Delaware marine ecologist Daniela Dixon was caught fabricating data about the behavior of fish inhabiting coral reefs in the South Pacific, where she claimed that carbon dioxide was changing their behavior. Basically, a little ocean acidification that caused them to behave differently. Well, some of her colleagues spotted that she was making up the data, that she couldn't possibly have done the experiments in the time that she claimed to do them. And the upshot of that was that they found that she was fabricating it. And that led Science, one of the major journals, to retract her paper, which means to pull it out, to say that it shouldn't be referenced anymore. So these things happen in many arenas. They're happening too often today. And as Matt Ridley, the famous, he's a zoologist, Ph.D. zoologist, but he's a journalist. He's a member of Parliament in the United Kingdom, member of the House of Lords. He's quite a guy. He said that outright fraud is but the tip of the iceberg. Exaggerating results is a far commoner reason why scientific publications cannot be treated as holy writ. And that means this whole publication system is awash in nonsense, or substantial nonsense, or some nonsense and some truth that you can't separate. So it needs to be fixed. And as a consequence, people used to pay a lot of attention to scientists, thinking that we dealt only with the truth. But the truth is that we deal with too much more in terms of personal ambition and a lack of we want to say morals, lack of attention to the absolute truth, something that utter honesty is what Feynman called it. It's no longer something that is considered important. Other things are more important. Getting attention is more important than doing things correctly. And that just, in the end, does end science. Science can't be something like politics, which is a field where quick comments, quick conclusions never hold up, and you just keep trying to pile more on top of what you've already said to push whatever you said that was wrong into the past. Science can't do that. Science has to be built on utter honesty, and too much of it today is not.
We're speaking with Gordon Fulks. He's a PhD in physics from the Laboratory of Astrophysics and Space Research at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that you wrote about was that the peer review process that really undermined what helps build the credibility of scientists themselves. How they, where people would rely if the government, if NOAA or NASA or some university published something, they would have a great deal of faith that it was almost certainly true. But in the past 20 years, that they've lost to the point where half the country, Republicans, that is, only have about 18% have trust in science and the media. And one of the reasons is, of course, that the overhyping of global warming, for example, which we deal with that frequently on this broadcast. But going back to years past, there would be a cataclysmic prediction, one from 2004 that most recently we dealt with, said that by the year 2020, Great Britain would be like Siberia, and not so. And so at some point, do scientists need to explain how they got these things wrong? Now, they'll tell me when I query them about it, they'll tell me, oh, we made a mistake in the calculation of the Atlantic jet stream, something that I'm not qualified to understand anyway. But they'll say, oh, yeah, we made a mistake in the calculation of the Atlantic jet stream and influence over this or that, and we needed to do this to calculate this accurately. We've gone back and fixed it, and now we know we are heading for calamity and that kind of thing. But does it really work? Is it working on people, or is it only working on willing politicians who want the extra power that this kind of thing is going to provide them?
Well, that's what's running in the background. So there are two issues here. One is honesty. Are they presenting honest results? And in too many situations, that's not. Are they exaggerating results? Yes. In many cases, they are. Are scientists always correct? Of course not. So we make mistakes, and we are allowed to make mistakes, and we try and correct them and go forward. And the way the system makes corrections is that they allow discussion of the topic. Climate alarmists won't allow discussion of the topics. I think that even in other fields like epidemiology, they don't allow discussion of the topics either, and they fire researchers like James Enstrom at UCLA for presenting that sort of contrary opinion. And yet this is the way you keep science honest, so you have to allow discussions. But honesty is the big issue at this point, exaggeration being a part of that honesty question. However, in terms of what we say, yes, we can make mistakes, and hopefully we graciously correct them and go forward. In many instances now, they found that they don't have to graciously correct them. They simply continue saying the same thing and dare you to say that they're dishonest, and then they sue you over that and that sort of thing. It's becoming an impossible situation, and in the end, it does end science when that occurs. So we have to find some way around that. We have to allow free and open discussions. We have to allow this corrective measures in science to, again, work. And that takes teaching children at a young level what the scientific method is, the utter honesty that's required there, and the verification. I can come up with an idea. The way that physics works, the way that many fields work, is that you have a phenomenon, you don't know what it's all about, you make up some explanation for it, and indeed you guess some explanation, and then you compute the consequences and you see if you can observe that. If you can't, if it doesn't match with experiment, or disagrees with experiment, as Feynman said, Richard Feynman, famous physicist, it is wrong. And that simple statement is the key to science. In other words, science has to be tied to some sort of reality. As the founders of the Royal Society in the United Kingdom in the 1600s said, nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. Think it through yourself. Don't pay attention to authority. Pay attention to what you see in front of you, to the experiment that you can do. And that's the key to science, experiments. That's something that in climate science they don't want to do anymore. They just want somebody to publish a paper and say, well, that's true. It's obviously hot somewhere, so that has to be global warming. Well, that's all nonsense. And that really does end science. And in the end, it does in our civilization that is dependent on science. We're wasting vast amounts of our wealth right now on windmills, on electric vehicles, on all sorts of other things that have no effect on the climate at all. And 50 years ago, people were smart enough to realize that you simply worked with the weather and adapted to it rather than trying to change it. Nobody has been able to change the weather significantly except in cities where it's a little warmer than the countryside. But that has nothing to do with carbon dioxide. That has to do with urbanization. So we've got to get science back on the objective path that it should be on. That begins with teaching children what the scientific method is. And the reason I wrote that paper is that many schools are completely dropping the requirement of teaching children what the scientific method is. They want them to simply think that it's an approach to reality that involves computers and whatnot, and need not be tied back to experiments. That is very wrong. That is very dangerous. It leads to much more of this cheating, if I can call it that, that is occurring today, particularly in climate science, but in many other areas too.
You see, maybe this is a more of a political question that's difficult for you to answer, but what I've noticed, the trend I've noticed as a layman, is that the government lays out a lot of money for research to study warming, global warming, and CO2 effects on it. And they seem to award those research grants to places that substantiate its desired outcome. It seems like is that what you're saying as well?
Well, that's entirely true. Yes, that's a large part of the problem. If the government stopped doing that, this whole controversy, the whole climate scam would evaporate practically overnight, because these people are looking for money. They will say what the contract monitors in the government want them to say and produce reports, research that verifies that. So we have to get away from that. And if we got away from it today, by next week, the tune would be changing at all of these universities. They get a great deal of money to support the government's contention that carbon dioxide is something that is dangerous, and they simply do it. I can't imagine that scientists would go along with that, but then I come from a different era where we tried to do good research. There were certainly problems with some scams out there, but not to the extent that they are today.
Well, I think the reality is that a lot of these scientists, like journalists, behave. They see the direction everybody's going, and they're saying, yeah, we could do a lot of good with that grant money. And so, maybe we go along with this because maybe it's true. There's enough people saying it might be true in our field that are saying it might be true. So we could probably go along with this and look at the grant money for the university. It would be used to do such great work. I mean, people can rationalize their willingness to be dishonest in that way, I would say.
Yeah, and indeed they do, Scott. But it's a Faustian bargain. You go along to have a few years of good luck, and then eventually the devil comes to collect on that. And it will with these people. When the climate turns colder and they have no explanation for it, they'll try and duck out, try and say, well, we really didn't say that, but now we're concerned about global cooling again, or something of that sort.
I, as a layman, in years of reading and studying global warming, reading papers and et cetera on the subject, it would seem to me that in the universe of studying climate change, there's a billion pieces of data, and would seem like the climate alarmists pick out a few hundred pieces of data out of a billion and arrange it to fit the narrative. Is that a fair assessment of what happens in these cases?
I think it is. You're right. You can always find some area of the planet that is hotter than normal. You can find some area of the planet that's colder than normal. So the climate becomes, I would say, a Rorschach test, where you show somebody an ink blot image, and they, because of their mindset, see some image in there that is something that is meaningful to them, but it is simply random events that you're looking at. And that's the reason people like to study the weather, is that it is very interesting. There's always something unusual happening, like this hurricane that came up through Southern California, the first in 80 years to do that. Most of the hurricanes simply turn in the Eastern Pacific, turn in across Mexico. This one came further north and came across the dry areas of California and Nevada. It's just fascinating to see that, and it's part of the random effects of weather, because we live on a fluid planet with vast oceans and atmosphere that are never in equilibrium. That's the fair statement of science. That's the accurate statement of science in regard to meteorology.
As we wrap up here, your organization, CO2 Coalition, is doing making attempts to try and help train some teachers and educate people on the scientific method. What is your thinking on this? Is it possible to reverse the trend that we've been heading towards?
It certainly is. People have been very receptive to the message that we've put forward in terms of teaching materials for children and in terms of trying to reach teachers, much more so in the private schools, in the charter schools, and others that are not tied to the teachers union and to the public schools. Because the public schools very much like to be part of the political scene.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fulks, for joining us today. For TNT's Through the Looking Glass, I'm Scott Wheeler, signing off.